So our next speaker is somebody who has a background in economics and business and has had a really illustrious career and held a number of really important governance roles. But his current role, which is the one that we're looking forward to him sharing with us, is as the chairperson for the Climate Change Commission. Please welcome Dr. Rod Carr.
Ana mana ina iwi tēnā koutou katoa ko Rod Carr aho. Thank you for the invitation to talk to you towards the end of your conference. My first engagement with housing was in the summer of 1979, beginning of 1980, when I was gathering data to write the dissertation for my honours degree in economics on the economics of urban renewal in Dunedin North, supervised by Heather Simpson, who went on to provide advice to Prime Ministers of the times later. So I look back over 40 years, and housing has never been far from my areas of interest. Some of you might perceive that what I'm about to say means horns grow from my head. The Bank of New Zealand, which when I first joined it was a state-owned bank, I was responsible for setting up New Zealand's first unit trust that invested in residential mortgages and the first mortgage security bonds that seeked to join investors with mortgage borrowers without the bank standing in the middle. In the later part of my career, I was the acting governor of the Reserve Bank in 2002 when inflation was getting away from us and we were putting up interest rates. Sound familiar? I'm now a director of the ASB Bank, where we have $60 billion of outstanding mortgages and a number of customers who are challenged by the rising interest rate environment that we and they confront. So sometimes things don't change. But the one thing I can tell you that is changing is the climate. And this is not just weather, and it is not a cycle. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of data, then I'm going to share with you a little bit about the recent work of the Climate Change Commission. In 2019, when I was asked to take on responsibility as the founding chair of New Zealand's independent expert Climate Change Commission, I pointed out to James Shaw that I was not a climate scientist, had never done any climate policy, and was not a climate activist. He thought that made me ideal for the role because I came with no baggage. The next 3.5 years has been an extraordinary journey for me in discovering what my children repeatedly tell me was known to a lot of other people. So I have a huge respect for those who have invested their entire working lives in trying to understand the science, the public policy, and generate action around climate. And many in this audience will have a similar experience trying to generate activity around affordable, accessible housing for New Zealanders. They are long journeys. Sometimes you feel you are not making progress. So a couple of data points in the science, which I find kind of useful to put this in a context. There are times when there has been more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there is today. That is true. Up to 10 times as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as there is today. That is true. We know that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are associated with the planet's surface temperatures. The geological record tells us so. Isotope analysis is able to correlate what we expect to have been the temperature, the carbon dioxide levels on the planet's surface back for millions of years. But we know for a fact that over the last 300 million years, which is only 6% of the time the planet has been orbiting the sun, so quite recently, but 300 million years is still a long time. At no time in the geological record is there any evidence that the average planetary temperature has been greater than +2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. that for 300 million years, the surface temperatures oscillated between -4 and +2 degrees centigrade around the average of temperatures as measured in the last half of the 19th century. Put 300 million years in context, trees as we know them turned up about 400 million years ago. The dinosaurs turned up about 260 million years ago. So we are heading past 1.5 degrees, and if all current policy initiatives were to be implemented, which seems highly improbable, we're on track to hit 2.8 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the end of this century. When you go to bed tonight, there will be more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there has been at any time in the last 800,000 years. And when you wake up tomorrow morning, there'll be even more. The problem isn't so much the level of carbon dioxide, although that will prove to be a problem. What is really challenging is the rate at which we are adding to it. One stage in the geological record over 5,000 years, something in the order of 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide was emitted. We are managing to do in 100 years what naturally happened over 5,000 years. How are we doing it? Lifting fossil fuels from the geosphere, combusting them in the atmosphere, and as a consequence, adding carbon dioxide at a rate that is unprecedented in the geological record. How will that manifest itself? Well, actually, the climate scientists are pretty clear. You have more energy in the atmosphere, more carbon dioxide dissolved in the oceans, so the oceans are more acidic, and the more energy in the atmosphere turns up as more extreme events more frequently. In some places, it is warmer, and drier, and wetter, and windier. And in some places where it didn't rain, it now rains. And in places where we have often seen rain, we won't see rain. I did a small piece of work for the Secretary General of the United Nations on greenwashing, and he just came back before we presented our report from Pakistan, where 32 million people had been displaced, a third of the country was underwater. And his observation was, you know what the real problem in Pakistan is? It's not the water that's there. It's that within the next 30 years, the glaciers that feed the rivers in the Indus Valley will be gone. We think of rivers as drains for the rain. In some parts of the world, the melting glaciers give them their drinking water and water for agriculture. So what do we need to do about it? What should we do globally? What should we do locally? Since 1990, the world has agreed, A, the climate is changing, B, humans are causing it, C, we need to stop it, and D, the sooner we stop it, the better off we'll all be. Half of all the carbon dioxide emitted by humanity has been emitted since 1990. So the science is pretty clear. We have to stop combusting fossil fuels in the open air. We have to stop it quickly. Unless we stop the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air, it won't really matter much about much else by the middle of this century. Climate policy is pretty clear too. We are going to need every tool in our arsenal. We are going to need markets and prices. We're going to need regulations which phase out and ban things. We are going to need to build a sustained political consensus for action. We're going to need to harness private capital and social capital. We're going to need to get people on board for the journey, and there will always be competing priorities, as there have been for the last 30 years. There will always be wars, recessions, depressions, changes of governments, new threats, pandemics. But every day of every week that we keep combusting fossil fuels in the open air, we're making the problem harder sooner. So when we come to New Zealand in 2019, 119 members of Parliament, every single member of Parliament present on that day voted for amendments to the Climate Change Response Act, known as the Carbon Zero Act, which put in place a number of things. The only absence, and we've got to remember it is in Hansard, so this is a true fact, as my children would say, a true fact, Dad, that no one voted against the Climate Change Response Act, and the one absentee was not present to vote at all. 119 members of Parliament established a target, the idea of budgets and plans, and the Climate Change Commission to provide independent advice to the government of the day about what the budget should be and how the plans might be achieved. But further, also to provide advice on the progress against plans that had been put in place and budgets once they had been approved, so that all New Zealanders would have the transparency to see the progress or lack of it, given the statements and commitments which our elected leaders had made. The Climate Change Commission is tasked, therefore, not only with giving advice, but also monitoring progress, and not only progress against mitigation, that is the reduction of emissions in line with plans and targets, but also progress against the National Adaptation Plan, drafted by the Ministry for the Environment, but adopted by the government of the day. And if we think mitigation, that is reducing our emissions, is going to be a challenge, I can tell you adapting to this warmer, wetter, windier and wilder world is truly going to be demanding. Mitigation is in our own self-interest. We will be better off if we stop burning liquid fossil fuels, coal and fossil gas. We will be healthier. We will be better off if we have lifestyles which rely on lower emissions, because those lifestyles will, by the middle of the century, be much more affordable than lifestyles based on high-emitting activities and ways of living. Our incomes will be much less vulnerable if they're not dependent on high-emitting business practices and the production of services and products that require high levels of emissions. So our self-interest will align with reducing emissions, and we will come to see that those who don't assist us in reducing our emissions are standing in the way of tremendous opportunities to build a better society for all of us. But adaptation is entirely different. The challenge with adaptation is we stand to lose a lot, and not all the losses can be compensated for. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment has done some work indicating how much low-lying public infrastructure is at risk given the climate change which is already baked in. And it's tens of billions of dollars. Not to make things better, either to patch them up or move them out of harm's way. In addition, we built houses on low-lying land because it was cheap and accessible. But we will now discover that houses on low-lying land are vulnerable, and we will need to either invest substantially to protect them or to relocate them before the end of their technical life. Unless you think we are a clever country, apparently Kāinga Ora have built 9,000 houses on floodplains since 2016. When will we stop doing dumb things? The Climate Change Commission, in its most recent draft advice and proposed recommendations, which are all out for public consultation at the moment, says a little, not a lot, about our built environment. It first points out that we will need, in parts of New Zealand, to increase the density of housing in order to facilitate lower transport costs and reduce congestion, to make it more likely that people can live close to where they work and earn a living. That is not a recipe for all of New Zealand. It is a proposal for parts of New Zealand. But more specifically, the Commission has also, in the Let's Stop Doing Dumb Things chapter, said we should stop connecting new structures to new fossil fuel pipelines. Don't sink capital into extending the gas pipe network that locks in thousands of dollars of appliances because the gas supplier gets a regulated, profitable rate of return on that capital. In addition, we've been pretty clear that when it comes to thinking about New Zealand's society and economy, while we don't have specific recommendations, the circular economy and the bioeconomy will have significant parts to play in helping New Zealand become more resilient to a changing climate, and you saw a well-worked case study just before. That currently New Zealand imports $4 billion a year of liquid fossil fuels with long supply chains, often from countries we don't share the same cultural values with. We now have known technologies to use domestically produced electricity from renewable sources to not only decarbonise ground transport for our own health and benefit, but to reduce our vulnerability to long and fragile supply chains over which we have no control, either about security of supply or the price. So I am optimistic for New Zealand about the opportunities to create a thriving and low emissions society. We need to get on with it, and it is in our own self-interest to do it. The challenging areas of adaptation, though, are far from resolved. What losses should be compensated and which should be left to lie where they fall? How extensive will insurability be when there is no longer a risk of flooding, but a near certainty? And what will happen to access to bank finance for uninsured properties? Because coming our way right now, and you've heard about it during the conference, the reality is the climate change is with us now. It is not a theory. It is not a model. It is not a public policy statement. It is the reality of the world that we have created. We need to reduce emissions so it doesn't get really, really bad, but also because it will be better for us if we do. But living in this warmer, wetter and wilder world is going to require a rethink about where we put our roads, where we put our houses, where we locate our schools, hospitals and businesses. And at the moment we have a highly fragmented, rather clumsy, slow-moving process for making really important decisions. Housing communities is absolutely critical to social coherence. And this journey we're on to create this thriving low-emission society needs to be sustained for decades. And that is why the climate policy agenda is so fixated about social justice. Is to make this journey, we need to be inclusive or we won't get there. The alienated and dispossessed will have little stake in a low emissions future unless they can see a part in that transition for them. Social cohesion is probably the biggest threat to developing and implementing a long-term plan. We need to figure out as a society in New Zealand how we use our almost unique set of resources to create and sustain for centuries to come ways of living that are good for us and good for our kids. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about the climate change in the context of housing and the challenges that face all of us. Kia ora.
So we do have time for a few questions, and I haven't seen any come through on the app, but I had some questions, so I wonder if you wouldn't mind answering. So the first one, and it's really for those of us who aren't particularly familiar with the Climate Change Commission, I'm imagining it's something like the Waitangi Tribunal where you can make non-binding recommendations, but I might be getting it wrong, so I'd just love to understand.
So you're absolutely right in the sense that the Commission is only advisory. We set no prices, write no regulations, enforce no laws. All we can do is provide advice, and then the government of the day can either take the advice or reject the advice. And we also have this monitoring function where we get to write reports about how good we're doing or not doing. The things that are slightly different about the Commission are that the government can't hide our advice. You know those reports that sometimes get commissioned that never see the light of day or kind of disappear for years and then suddenly pop up again? The way the Act is written is that we provide advice. The Minister of Climate Change has 20 business days in which to table our advice in the House, or we release it publicly. So there's no hiding. And that's one lever that the politicians agree would be helpful for them in the future. Secondly, and it is yet to be seen, our first monitoring artefacts, that is things that are related to this monitoring function, turn up in the middle of next year. So far, most of our advice has been about how do we achieve emissions budgets, how do we reduce emissions, how do we do that? And to some extent, most of that advice has been taken. There's a kind of exception around pricing in the emissions trading scheme, but that's a different set of issues. I think in the middle of next year, when we provide our first report on progress against the National Adaptation Plan and the first emissions plan, I think that's the point when we're going to need a lot of friends. I think you use political capital pretty quickly when you call out good intentions that may not have actually been given effect to. And there is limited evidence that we are on track at the moment, notwithstanding a few recent large public announcements.
Thank you. I really appreciate that clarification. I do have one more question, which is really, does the Commission have any role in providing industry-specific advice, say to architects or builders or to people in agriculture?
So our advice is on the direction of policy. So to give you an example, we certainly are very strongly in favour of the rapid build-out of additional renewable energy. So identify the barriers to scaling up wind and solar production and figure out how to do more of that sooner, because we need the electricity to displace coal, fossil gas and liquid fossil fuels with known technology. Right? All of this stuff exists today. We know how to build wind turbines, we know how to build solar farms, we know how to get battery electric cars, and I'm going to give you a whole lecture on battery electric cars and why they're good, but we won't go there at the moment. Even if you want to make hydrogen, you've got to actually get electricity to make hydrogen. So all roads come from renewable generation. Turns out New Zealand has some extraordinary resources when it comes to renewable energy production. We do need to use what we produce wisely, which is why we need to insulate our homes and buildings, why we need to use modern and advanced technologies like modern heat pumps that make the electricity go further. It's why where there is an agency problem, i.e. the landlord won't do what's in the tenant's interest and the tenant can't do it because they don't get property rights in the building, we need to figure out how to get that resolved so that we get drier homes at lower cost to heat, even if the occupant is not the owner of that structure. And whether that's something through targeted rates, which we're in and then we're out, but should probably be back, whether that's through the way the banks provide finance, whether that's through community engagement, we know the problem. It's a principal agency problem. It's not new in economics. We just need to figure out a solution in our context. So I think, that's a direction of policy. We think markets and prices have an important part to play, but we need complementary policies. We are not prepared to pay the true price of emissions needed to reduce our emissions because we're not prepared to live with the implications for distribution of income and implications for those most vulnerable and least able to change their emissions profile. For them, It isn't a matter of choosing less because they may have no choices. Time may give more options, but in the short term, all you do is create crippling costs. So we need prices where prices can change behaviour, and we need complementary policies where they can't.
I think Paul might have a question. Awesome. Kia ora.
Thanks very much, Rod. Just interested what your response is to those who say that your advice and recommendations are impractical, unworkable, or we're already doing best practice around the place.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm always interested when people tell me precisely what the advice is that is unworkable, impractical, or because it's easy to throw a general blob of mud. What I would say is the Commission doesn't give advice unless it completely believes that what it is recommending is affordable and practical. It was really interesting when we were doing our forecasts for the take-up of battery electric cars. It was the Motor Vehicle Importers Association who told us our draft advice was way off. Never going to be that many of them. They're not available. New Zealanders won't buy them. They can't get them if they do want them anyway. So we dialed back our forecast of the uptake of battery electric cars, only to discover the uptake rate in New Zealand today is exactly what it was in our draft advice before the vested interest beat us up about it. When it comes to those in agriculture who say, no, we're the best in the world, we may be the best in the world at ruminant, livestock, pastoral agriculture. It's like the Americans saying they won the World Series, right? It's like, yeah, against themselves, right? You can define a class in which you're the best, but is that the class where the competition is going to take you? And I think the challenge in agriculture is the rest of the world is developing low-emitting ways of producing meat and milk protein. So, all of that is the challenge we need to rise to. The technologies are available in many cases. New Zealand has one of the highest per capita rates of emission, even if you set aside all of agriculture. Right? So we're about 16 tonnes per capita of gross emissions for each one of the 5 million of the team. Set aside agriculture was 8 million tonnes, you're left with 8 million tonnes left. All of China, counting everything, including those horrible coal-fired power stations that make stuff we buy, right, is 5 tonnes per capita. We just waste a lot. We voted ourselves some of the cheapest but highest emitting motor vehicles of any wealthy country. So the rest of the world looks at us and kind of says, there's a lot of choices you can make, but you do have to make some choices. He's getting a workout today.
I was ready to cut the question, so this is the last one.
I just like seeing him run around the place because he does. The energy he uses, Rod, is amazing. Rod, I just want to ask two questions of you. One is, if we look at Meridian, which has the need to invest in renewable resources, renewable energy, it knows how to do it. The government owns 51% of the company. 49% shareholders have reduced the company to the point where Meridian can't afford to make the investment in renewable energy. And if it does make that investment, the rest of its investments will be worth less. How do we address some of the mistakes of the past when this sort of asset was sold? That's my first question. And my second question, share with everybody what your kids said to you.
All right, look, let's do the easy one first. The easy one is, how do we undo mistakes of the past? The mistakes of the past you can never address unless you're prepared to actually understand them and take them up. And that's the first thing. Unless we actually understand that our electricity market is a regulated market, it's one that we created, we made up, we made choices, and therefore it is an artifact of our own creation. It's not a law of nature or a law of physics or even a law of economics. It is a piece of public policy we chose. If, as a consequence of that public policy choice, we are not getting the outcomes that we need in order to get on this transitional journey, then we need to have a pretty serious conversation about the regulatory architecture that allows enormous economic rent to incumbent generators. So the Climate Change Commission, in its draft advice previously and in its final advice on the first emissions reduction plan, pointed out that roughly, if the Tiwai smelter was to shut down and all that power was to be dropped into the national grid, so two big ifs, if it shut down and if the power was dropped into the grid, wholesale electricity prices would be 20% lower for the next decade than they would be if Tiwai stayed. So that's a public policy choice. New Zealand Steel is going to decommission 2 of its 4 coal-fired kilns for making steel, which is great. They're going to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions from 2028 by about 800,000 tonnes a year. We should all clap loudly, that's great. They're going to need 50 megawatts of electricity in order to do that, and Contact have agreed they'll supply it. That's great, tick that box. But the residual emissions from making steel in New Zealand are about 1.2 million tonnes a year, so over a decade with a 90% free allocation, because we've got a system that gives them a free allocation. There's 10 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions that need to be paid for from somewhere else. Either other polluters pay polluters, which is a bit of a zero-sum game, or taxpayers are going to fund 10 tonnes of emissions over 10 years to save 4,000 jobs making steel in New Zealand, which may be a great investment. I'm not knocking that. And it's certainly better to be 800,000 tonnes less if you're going to do it. But again, these are public policy choices about a strategic interest in making steel in New Zealand from our iron sands, using our renewable electricity, but we will still end up with 1.2 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions from steel making for the next decade that needs to be purchased to meet our nationally determined contribution. Or we could plant another 50,000 hectares of pine trees. Choices. New Zealand is blessed with choices, but that becomes the challenge of actually making choices. It's like, could be this, could be that, maybe this, maybe that, maybe now, maybe later. And as for what the kids said, well, one of my kids said to me recently, he said, so Dad, there's 10 minutes after you finish being chair of the Climate Change Commission where the world might still listen to you. What would you say when you weren't the chair anymore? And I had that conversation with him and he said, all right, so now why don't you say that now? So we'll save that for another day. Kia ora.